Well, last time we saw that Charles V aspired to become the new Roman emperor, holy but nevertheless Roman emperor, with his vast holdings, his vast lands, and to subordinate not only Latin America but all the European states or kingdoms to his rule. But we saw that there were three clusters of opposition to Charles V. And remember, I said that he had to deal with the Ottoman state, which was gaining momentum. He had to deal with the internal Protestant revolt that broke out in Germany and began to spread elsewhere, and he could not control. And finally, he had to deal with the rivalry with France and also England. And it is to France and England I want to turn now, in contrast to this idea of a united Europe under the rule of Charles V and the Catholic Church. You get this emergence of what we call the territorial state, and the which I've been describing in terms of Spain, the emergence of Spain. Well, something parallel to that happens in France and England, and these states are not prepared to accept the dominance of Charles V. And so, in contrast to the idea of a single united Europe, Catholic and imperial, you have the emergence of a Europe of rival territorial states, which becomes a characteristic of European society from this point onwards, and becomes the general form of politics in the early modern and modern period, really down to the present, because this centralized territorial state has become the general form of the state in terms of the world. So let's then look at France and England and see how they developed in the late Middle Ages and after 1500. Well, like Spain, during the late Middle Ages, and this is true of Europe in general, there was huge disorder. Whatever political authorities there had been descended into a kind of anarchy, and the anarchy was led by the nobility. You saw that there was great disorder in Spain. Well, the same thing is true in France and in England. There was generalized anarchy, and the anarchy was led by the nobility. The nobility was the cause of the anarchy. Their position in society was threatened by economic decline and uprisings from below, and so they responded by what we can call a class war from above. The nobility were running wild, okay? And we saw how this anarchy was gradually brought under control and channeled by Ferdinand and Isabella. Similar things happened in France and England. Now, the violence, in terms of the French and the English, particularly took the form of a huge and prolonged war between the nobilities of France and England, which we call the 100 Years' War. It broke out in the middle of the 14th century, and it continued for 100 years, down to 1453. Certainly the kings were involved and so on, but the social thrust of this was noble anarchy. Well, we see that this was largely, this violence played itself out, particularly in France, which was devastated by both the French and the English nobility during the 14th and 15th century. But finally, in 1453, the French particularly the common people, rallied behind the monarchy, and the monarchy was able to get enough force. And the most memorable figure in this campaign to expel the English was the name actually of a woman. Does anybody know the name of this woman? Yes.
Joan of Arc.
Yes, Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc arises from amongst the people. She's a peasant. And religiously inspired, she inspires the French armies. Of course, they had cannons and they had new rifles and so on, but with this rallying, the French were able to expel the English, and a reconsolidation of France as a kingdom began from this point onwards. More about that in a minute. Now, the English nobility disappointed because they no longer had France as a kind of playground for themselves. They had to retreat to England, and no sooner did they retreat to England, but war broke out between different factions of the English nobility, and this continued until finally a new king emerged. His name was Henry VII, and in 1485 he defeated his rivals, and here in 1485, 30 years after it began in France, a reconsolidation of England also occurred. So by the end of the 15th century, France and England, under new and strong royal leadership, was beginning to consolidate its territorial states, putting end to the noble violence that had marked the late Middle Ages. Now, in France, the key thing that happened was, faced with the incredible sort of violence of nobles, the middle class, and we could also include the craftsmen and the peasants, they rallied to the king, but in order to strengthen the king, a system of taxation was established at that time, and these financial means allowed the king to create a royal army. And the royal army was the instrument which not only expelled the English, but also curbed the individualistic anarchy of the noble class. So taxation from the common people is what gives the king the ability to create an army. And this army, the key elements of it were a new cavalry and an artillery train, about 80 or 100 cannons. And this was important because the nobles, the individual nobles, were holed up in their castles all over France, and the only way you could get them, control them, was basically attack these castles with cannons. The only way you could break them down. So this train of artillery was very important. And then you had this new cavalry. The king didn't trust the townsmen, the king and the new state, the common people in France already at this time were extremely unruly, particularly against the nobles. And so the new army was largely dominated by noble cavalry, which now was disciplined and was obedient because they were paid by the king. They were paid by the king. So they became, instead of individualistic gangs and brigands, the nobles, the leading nobles, joined the king's army and became the cavalry of the new royal army. Now, in England, there was a different, things took a different direction because although, of course, it had some armed forces, land forces, England was separated from the rest of the continent by the English Channel, and Therefore, the stress was put on the Navy. The English Navy became the major instrument of the English monarchy. Backing this up was again a train of artillery, largely used against any nobleman who decided to rebel against the king in his fortress. The fortress was demolished by the artillery of the king. So you see, what I stressed was a source of taxation, an army, but also important in terms of consolidating the state was the establishment of royal courts, a legal system, a centralized legal system in both countries emerged at this time under the king, and a bureaucracy that begins to keep that are again in the pay of the king, which keeps above all the important aspect of this is the fiscal bureaucracy, the tax people who basically collect the taxes from the common people, which provides the resources for the army and the rest of the apparatus of the emerging state. We could also mention that the kings at this time, and this is true of Madrid in Spain, it's true of France and England, they created a kind of a new institution, a kind of permanent royal court. In the king invited many of the leading nobles to join him at the court and built. At this time, you see there's a great building of royal palaces and chateaux, country houses, mansions occupied by the kings, which are staffed by a court filled with royal servants, of course, but also noblemen, and also the leading artists and writers come to these courts. They become centers of cultural attraction. This sort of is the sort of cultural element of the emergence of the power of of these territorial kings, the royal court. And for example, in France at this time, that is to say, beginning of the 16th century, there were something like 8,000 people who were attending the king at the royal court. And similar numbers we have for the English court, not as great, but also the court down in Spain. So the royal court is an aspect of this. Now, a final element in terms of this state consolidation was the church. And as I think I mentioned in passing, but it should be emphasized, the church was virtually an independent, the church in France or in England or Spain had been more or less an independent power, just as the nobles were largely independent of the king. Likewise, the church during the Middle Ages, whose head, of course, was the Pope. King wasn't the head. They didn't really, they were not under the political command of the monarchies. But by the beginning of the 16th century, that changed in a significant way. We've already seen this in Spain with Ferdinand and Isabella. The royal power there emerged. Part of it was control over the Spanish church. Of course, Spain remained ardently Catholic, but the Pope gave political authority, the right to collect the revenues of the church, the power of the Inquisition. This was all placed in the hands, essentially, of the monarch. And more or less the same thing happened in different ways in Spain and France. In France, in 1516, there was a king, Francis I, and in the Umlern, under illustrations, I have a shot of a portrait of King Francis I. He was the most important king of the first part of the 16th century in France. He negotiated an agreement with the Pope in 1516, which is known as the Agreement or Concordat of Bologna. This happened in Bologna, Italy, so it's called the Concordat of Bologna. And essentially, it gave political control of the French church to the French king from that point on. And in England, it took a different form. The most important church office in England was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the king at that time, who was Henry VIII, appointed a man who was actually the son of a butcher, which gives you a sense of movement upwards from the middle class. His name was Thomas Wolsey. His name is spelled in concepts in Umler. And Wolsey was a complete creature, servant of the King of England, and he made sure that essentially control over the English church was in the hands of the monarchy. Of course, for a few more years, England remained Roman Catholic, and we'll see that there's a change after a while. So, what we see here is that if we look at Spain, if we look at France, if we look at England, we see a royal army or navy, we see a royal court, we see a bureaucracy, we see law courts, a judicial system, we see the church falling under the control of the monarchy. The same process. And we see furthermore that to complete the picture, that wherever they can, for example, up in Sweden, there's a new monarchy there. Of course, Sweden is peripheral; it has no importance, or it's a third or fourth-rate power. But the king in Sweden is doing the same thing. He looks at France, he looks at England, he tries to do that. The king of Denmark, same thing, and we see. Even in Germany, which is very divided. Germany is the most feudal country. There were actually 300, if you can imagine, feudal lords who controlled Germany at this time. It's completely divided. There is the emperor, but the emperor really has no power. Well, wherever they can, these little princes, for example, in Saxony or Bavaria, etc., they're setting up little courts, little armies, and you see here and there in Italy, which is also a divided country, the same thing at Ferrara, for example, or in Savoy, in Italy. There's a little prince who has a little bureaucracy, has a law court, etc. They're trying to imitate, but of course they never achieve the power, just imitating the power of these territorial monarchies. Now, I want to reiterate the fact that I said that the middle class is very important to this process because they provide money, taxes. Without that, the territorial state is not conceivable. But and they also provide the tax people and the judges. Sons of the nobles go to law school and they become lawyers, and so administratively the territorial state cannot function. But at the top, if you look at the army or the navy, or you look at the church, the senior figures in all of these remain the nobility, and they're going to remain the senior figures until the French Revolution. So at the end of this period that we're dealing with, the nobles remain dominant within the state because the king doesn't want to abolish the nobility, he just wants to control it. He himself is a nobleman, he's the first of the noblemen, so he wants this class to remain, but he wants to discipline them, and that's the essential characteristic of things. The middle class is gaining more and more economic power, social power, a certain political influence, but they're always uh, below the nobles. That's the way you have to sort of understand this. A second characteristic of these states is that they fight one another. There's continuous rivalry, political rivalry between these different territorial states that I've mentioned, the big and the small. They're constantly in motion, they're fearful that one of the states will become very powerful, like Charles V, and he will want to take them over. So, in order to prevent that, they ally with other princes. They make all kinds of alliances. And in the 16th century, particularly the French and the English are getting together to offset the power of the Spaniards. We call this the balance of power. And it's a new thing between these territorial states. And it's important because it becomes a characteristic of politics in Europe from this point onwards, and ultimately global politics. Even today, we see that there does exist the game of the balance of power. We see that the United States and its vassals or allies, including Canada, who's, I don't want to get started on that, but that's one side. And then we see this alliance between Russia and China and their friends. And the balance of power is playing itself out. So this starts in the 16th century. Now, all of this has to be understood in terms of your study of capitalism and the world market, which I've made a big fuss about, because these states, of course, they are the independent centers of political power, but they have to somehow fit themselves in and deal with the fact that a world capitalist market is emerging. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, I want to say something about the contrast between the English and the French. They are alike, as I've tried to explain. There's a lot of similarities between them, but they do evolve in different directions. Because the French state, which, as I said, began to rally in the middle of the 15th century, with the king at that time was a man by the name of Charles VII, and his Joan of Arc was his servant. In order to get the tax money from the French middle class and the French people, he, as was customary, he called a meeting of the Estates General, the representative body in the Middle Ages, representative bodies that appeared. The monarchies trying to get some power began to create what we call representative institutions, constitutional bodies. The noblemen, the clergy, and the wealthy merchants would be called together in some sort of states or parliaments. This happened during the Middle Ages. Well, the French had their States General, just like the English had their parliament. But what happens is that when the French estates meet, they're so eager to have the king deal with the violence that they vote permanent taxes to the king. Everybody every year is going to have to pay regular salt taxes, regular income taxes, and regular sales taxes. Something similar has happened already in Spain, and this is happening in France as well. Well, if you give the executive permanent taxing powers with no check, basically you're going to have a what we call an irresponsible government. That is to say, the government will become absolute in its power. And sure enough, we see in Spain and in France, those monarchies, the executive, the king, has all this fiscal power. He doesn't need to consult the common people. He can do whatever he wants. And so Spain and France evolved in the direction of what we call absolutism, absolute monarchies. The power of the kings gets stronger and stronger and stronger as the decades and generations wear on, right through this period, until again the French Revolution. But in England, it's a different story because I would say that the middle class in England was already stronger than it was in France or in Spain. There, of course, there was the Parliament, and the Parliament didn't disappear. The king found it useful, but also it's obvious that the pressure from the middle class was such that the king was forced on a regular basis to call parliaments. And the essential function of the parliament was not only to approve the laws, but to grant the king taxes. And the need to call parliaments all the time eventually led to what we call, in contrast to absolutism, constitutional monarchy, constitutional government, as compared to absolute government. And finally, we should note that all of this is unfolding, and of course, I'm dealing with the general principles, but we should realize that in the case of England, the power of the new monarchy is symbolized by the emergence of this powerful dynasty or dynasty. The Tudor dynasty is the dynasty that dominates from the late 15th until the beginning of the 17th century. The first of these kings is Henry VII. I mentioned all of this is listed in keyword. Henry VII, followed by his corpulent and robust son, who is a decisive figure, Henry VIII, followed by the even more important and great Queen, Elizabeth I. It's under Elizabeth I that English power really flowers. It's under Elizabeth in the second half of the 16th century. And we will tell these stories. In France, the key figure is Charles VII, who's called the Well-Served because of Joan of Arc and other prominent military leaders, Charles VII, in the 15th century. And then I've mentioned him already, Francis I, or Francois Premier, a portrait of whom I put into the illustrations in Umler. So that, given the consolidation of strong states in England and France, the dream of Charles V turned out to be a mirage. That's the conclusion we can come to. Because throughout the first part of the 16th century, there were great wars between these rivals, and at the end of the day, Charles V was unable to control France and England and the rest of Europe, and so the outcome was that Europe remained divided from this point onwards. The territorial state became the dominant form of political organization rather than empire, like the Roman Empire, or indeed we can say the Chinese Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, or the empire in India. Europe took the form of these sovereign territorial states who were essentially rivals to one another. And the result of this, in some ways, was negative because they were constantly at war. The kings, particularly, well, all of them, were trying to constantly raise taxes on the common people to fight these wars. And in the case of France and Spain, people paid heavily. The common people were oppressed. What we can call this is a kind of collective rent that was collected by the kings, and the common people, a good part of their income basically went to the central government and they groaned under this weight. Furthermore, at least on the continent, these constant wars were extremely damaging, destructive of life and property. This constant war, there was a huge cost to these wars, and again, the common people paid the price. Their towns, their fields, their persons were destroyed by these wars. And sometimes they would last for years. In Germany, you have the famous 30 Years' War, and millions and millions of people perished in the course of these wars that I'm speaking about. So there was a price. On the other hand, we can say that this the constancy of war, there was not a year when there was not some kind of a war going on in Europe during this whole period that I'm speaking about. But in order to find the resources for these wars, which grew more and more expensive, at a certain point, toward the end of the 16th century, after there had been about a century of these wars that I'm speaking about, the governments realized that to be sure, they continued to perfect their tax systems, but they had to basically try to develop their economies in order to find the resources to fight. They had to develop their agriculture. They had to develop particularly their industry, and especially industries geared to war, but other industries as well. And they had to protect the economy against the economies of other states. And so from toward the end of the 16th centuries, you can say it started in Holland, but it spread to the rest. Gradually, a system of protection and state-directed development began in most of these states, most of these governments. And so the state began to deliberately, it even gave money, subsidies to key entrepreneurs to try to develop various aspects of the economy. And we call this system a system of mercantilism. The market, of course, was developing, but this was a state-directed market. And one of the key features here was keeping out the products of other countries. Remember, I said that the Spanish nobility didn't do this. They didn't care about industry. They had gold. Well, in the rest of Europe, they did care. And so you have this protectionism, state protection, and interference in direction of the market. We call this system mercantilism. And it's a system which invented at the end of the 16th century, and it continued until we could say the French Revolution again. Now, I want to say something a little bit more about the wars. And this is a constant feature of Europe. I mean, any idea that you might have that the European are Pacific, you can forget about that. No, they're belligerent. They're belligerent with one another, and of course, it equips them, their aggressiveness, their belligerence, to basically conquer other peoples. Colonialism, imperialism, it emerges out of this aggression. And we still have it today. Well, looking at the wars between 1500 and 1789, notice at the beginning the wars, it's all about the kings, their territorial ambitions, the noblemen were eager to fight because the nobles, their raison d'etre, their reason for being is to fight, to win glory in war is the greatest thing that a nobleman can do. To say nothing, it gets the attention of the king, and this nobleman this family can ascend because of the distinction in battle that it wins. So so these wars are about territorial aggrandizement very much the conception of the feudal class and of the king. However, as time wore on, the character of the wars changes. These ambitions remain, they remain, but gradually, as part of mercantilism, the kings more and more fight these wars for commercial reasons. From being essentially a continuation of the old feudal conflict, they take on this aspect of commercial war. And certainly by the end of the 17th, 18th centuries, the wars that are being fought are commercial wars. They're all about economics and commerce, gaining the upper hand, gaining resources, gaining mining areas, gaining new markets in the colonies. And by the 18th century, the main wars are colonial wars, especially between the French, the Dutch, and the English in the 18th century. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that the armies and navies that are fighting these wars, the scale of warfare grows over these 300 years. There are more, the armies are becoming larger and larger, the navies are getting larger and larger. For example, Francis I, I mentioned, he had his largest army that he fielded was about 25,000 troops. This is the first part of the 16th century. By the time you get toward the end of the 17th century, the king, Louis XIV, who was the greatest of the French kings of this period, his army is 500,000 men. He's fighting the rest of Europe with 500,000 troops. This is larger than the Roman army during antiquity. So, and this is not untypical. And likewise, the navies are growing, and also the ships. I showed you a figure of a cog, a small naval vessel. They're enormous, sailing vessels, heavily armed, and very expensive. So you have a vast expansion of the cost of warfare, and therefore the taxation systems develop apace. The major expense is war, and you have that. And furthermore, of course, war becomes more and more technically sophisticated during this period. The armies, which are completely undisciplined, rabble basically, they give them rifles or swords, or they use horses and so on. But by the late 17th century, 18th century, warfare is highly organized. There are books and manuals written about this. And the armies, the logistical systems, the supply systems, the weapons, there's a continuous improvement in rifles, in muskets, in pistols, in fortifications, in the naval engineers emerge as a profession who build the great men of war, the great sailing ships, based on more or less engineering principles. Engineering as a subject begins to emerge during those periods. So there is this growing sophistication. And of course, with this of course connects with the state's need to grow the economy, to develop manufacturing capacity, and generally a mercantilist policy. So that's what I would say about that. And I'm mentioning it because all of this is a review question, which I'll get to in the next class. Now, as part of what is happening, I mentioned all these aspects of the growth of the political power of these governments, but there's also the cultural power. I've mentioned the royal courts. The royal courts of course, are the center of politics. If you want an office, if you're a nobleman, you're looking for office, you're looking for a pension, you're looking to command a military unit, you have to go to the court and you have to uh, kiss the feet of the king or the queen. You have to ingratiate yourself. But also, the kings and the queens invite the great writers and artists uh, to uh, live at the court because a great artist, a great writer brings luster to the monarchy. Culture is a power, and um, what we see starting in the beginning of the 16th century is the emergence of this new sort of power associated with the strong states that I've been talking about, and which we call Renaissance culture, the culture of the Renaissance. Now, the culture of the Renaissance. What does Renaissance mean? Well, we have the word naissance in French, naissance, which means birth. So Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what? Rebirth of the culture of the Romans, the great Romans, the great Greeks. They created this great Latin and Greek culture. They created philosophy. They created history. They created poetry. In the schools, the model is, what did the Romans have to say about this? What did the Greeks? What did Aristotle? What did Plato? What did Cicero? What did Seneca? What did these great Roman and Greek figures have to say about um, uh, the meaning of life? Okay? And so this culture of the Renaissance based itself on an aspiration to return to the great days of antiquity. Those were the glory days. They didn't really have a sense of progress, of innovation as an end in itself, as we do, as we still do. The idea of progress, it barely existed. Rather, the idea was return to the ancient world. If we could only get back there, we would be as great as the Greeks and the Romans. Now, this Renaissance culture actually, it didn't begin in Northern Europe, didn't begin in Spain. It began in Italy in the 14th century. And it was the middle class living in the cities of Italy, and particularly in the city of Florence, which is still, of course, an amazing place to visit. It was there that the scholars and artists, starting in the 14th century, invented this new culture. And it's notable that it was a middle class culture to begin with. And what happens is that over time, it becomes so brilliant that the kings, the nobles in the north, seeing the luster of this middle class culture, they begin to absorb it into their culture. It becomes the culture of these territorial states in the 16th century. So I want to say more about this Renaissance culture. And it's basically three key elements. There was what we call humanism, which was basically all about studying the Greek and Roman writers, using them as a model for writing literature, poetry, philosophy. They tried to recover as much as possible. That was what humanism was all about. But what greatly facilitating humanism was the invention of printing, the printed book, a new invention, just as gunpowder was a new invention, or the compass. The printed book was invented in Germany in the 15th century, and it spread like wildfires. It spread like the internet spread. It was the internet of the 15th century, and the printed book People before that had to write every book. It took half a year to manufacture a book by handwriting on a parchment or on a on pieces of paper. You had to laboriously copy or write down, and there was only one copy. Suddenly, you have printing, the printing press, and that transforms the whole sort of culture, because everything that these humanists are writing now, is being printed in a book. And instead of one person being able to read it, now 1,000, 10,000, hundreds of thousands of people can read the same uniform pamphlet or book or what have you. So suddenly the middle class begins to send its kids to school because being literate actually makes some sort of sense. And so printing is also connected with the spread of what we call public schools, particularly amongst the middle class. I'm not talking about the peasantry here. I'm talking about the townspeople. They begin to learn to read and write with the printed book. So we have humanism, we have the printed book, and the last part are the fine arts. The fine arts in the Umlern and illustrations. I have the copy of a painting, the most famous painting, painted by Leonardo da Vinci. What is the most famous painting of Leonardo da Vinci? Mona Lisa. I use that. There's also The Last Supper, but the Mona Lisa is, everybody goes to Paris to see the Mona Lisa. But of course, Leonardo is just one. You have Raphael, you have Michelangelo, Botticelli, you have a huge number of great artists. The visual culture, also architecture, based on Roman and Greek models. So there's this cultural flowering. And as I say, it actually starts amongst the craftsmen in Florence. But they throw up a series of geniuses, and the noblemen say, well, I must have this work. And so on, you get the invention of what's called fine arts. But it begins with the craftsman, and it's always related to the craftsman. So the Renaissance, humanism, the printed book, and the flourishing of the fine arts. This becomes the new culture, and it becomes the culture of the court by the beginning of the 16th century. Now, I want to contrast, to conclude, the culture of the church, which dominated the Middle Ages, had been a culture basically of preparing for the next world. This world doesn't matter. You're just praying and going to church, taking the Mass, in order to get ready for the next world. It was an otherworldly culture. The culture of the nobles was all about killing and dancing and making love. That's what the nobilities believed in. But the culture of the humanists, as it started out, and I mentioned the names of the earliest, Dante, Boccaccio, Petrarch. Certainly they believed in love, but they believed also in individual ambition, individual achievement, what they called a sort of a rational approach to life. Instead of the passions dominating, the reason needed to be practical reason was necessary. They also believed in a certain patriotism after the Romans. The Florentines, for example, they were deeply devoted to their city, which was an independent city, ruling over the territory, and they believed in what they called civic patriotism. So rationality, civic patriotism, individual ambition, and also they believed in money. Money. Well, the church, whatever it was pocketing on the side, nevertheless the idea that you would accumulate money is an end in itself, wealth, personal wealth, this was inconceivable. And the noblemen's, yeah, by all means, they wanted money, but they didn't want to work for it, and they spent it as soon as they got it. Whereas this middle class culture, it was all about saving money and accumulation. So what I'm saying is that these are the roots, the foundations of capitalism here. Humanism emerges out of that. This is a new culture of the marketplace that we're dealing with. We'll have more to say about this on Monday. No class on Friday.